In this lesson we're going to examine events, and events are basically actions that occur whenever a user interacts with your application in some way, or whenever another application, such as Windows, interacts with your application. And way back in the early 1990s, Visual Basic was one of the first programming environments that supported the event-driven programming model, where you'd actually interact with a user interface, and then as a result of that interaction some code would be executed. So when you come across the term an event handler, that is actually code that performs only when an event is triggered. So some code in your applications will be dormant and will not be used unless they are triggered in some way by the user. For example, whenever a user clicks a button or perhaps moves your application or resizes the window of the application, those are all kinds of things that can trigger an event, and you can decide as the application programmer whether or not you want to handle that event. Or, put another way, you can decide if you want to write code that responds whenever somebody triggers that event. When an event is triggered, it's sometimes referred to as raising an event, or an event has been raised to your application. So the most obvious question is, how do you know what events are even available to you to write code behind? There's actually two ways to determine what events are supported by the form that you're working with or with a given user control. So the first way is to actually double click on either the form or the control that you're working with, and what will happen is it'll create the method signature or the stub. That means it's a method or a structure that has no actual code in it, but the stub for the event, for the default event for that form or control. So in this case, you can see we're looking at form 1, and there's an event called load. So we have this private void object sender system event args e. You don't have to worry about any of that for right now. That'll come into importance later on as you come to understand more about how C# and the .NET framework work. But for right now, let's suffice it to say that Visual Studio.NET nicely creates for you this little area where you can write code. So you'll write code between these brackets, and that will basically handle the event that occurs whenever the form first appears on your Windows desktop. So the act of double clicking on a form or on a control, if we had a control on here, will give us the method signature for the default event for that object. Now in this case the load event is the default object, but you know there's got to be more events than just form loading. Like, wouldn't you expect there to be the corollary form 1 close or unload? So how do you get to some of those? Well, unlike Visual Basic, which allows you to basically go up to this little drop down box and select an object, and then on the right hand side select the event or the method that's supported by that object, there's actually a different way to do that in C#. Let's go back to our designer surface and drag and drop a text box onto our designer surface, and you'll notice that as we select our text box that it shows up here in our properties window, and to see all the events for that object text box 1, we just need to click this little lightning bolt icon, and now we can see a list of all of the methods, or I'm sorry, all of the events that can be handled by our application. So let's take a look at just a few. It looks like they're categorized here. There's a double click action, or let's move on down here. There's a drag and drop event, drag, leave, drag over. Okay, there's others like entering, leaving, key down, key press, key up. So you've got just a ton of these different events that are fired as different things happen to our text box. Now our job as programmers is to determine which of these will actually help us accomplish what the requirements for our application have specified that the application should behave, the way that the application should behave. Now let's notice one other thing. Let's scroll down here and we'll notice that by default this text changed is selected. I did not select this. This happens to be the default event for our text box. So if I were to double click, let's just double click our text box object here in the designer, notice that text change appears. Let's go back and look at the other events that are available. And let's scroll up here to an event called leave, and this event fires whenever the focus is lost off the text box. So that means whenever we use our mouse to click on another control on our form, or whenever we use the tab button on our keyboards to move away from that text box and go to a different control, then this event is fired. And so we can write code that, for example, validates the text in that text box and forces the user to adhere to some sort of formula that you want them to, or whatever the case might be. So in order to create a method stub for this leave event, all I need to do is select the drop down. But these are already events that are handled by other actions that we take with our controller, with our form. So in order to create a unique method signature or method stub for this event, I'm just going to double click this leave cell here on the left hand side, and when I do, notice that it puts me into this text editing window where it automatically creates the text box 1 leave event method stub for me. So look, just for fun, let's write some code in here to show us a message whenever any of these events are fired off from our application. So let's start up by typing message box, and let me reiterate that capitalization is very important in C#. So if you don't capitalize the M or the B, you won't get anything. When you capitalize both the M and the B and you click the period, that you'll notice now that you get a little drop down helper. So we want to use the show method of our message box, and in here we're going to type in the word leave. Okay, so whenever the leave event occurs, then it will show a little message box. And don't forget, we haven't talked about this in depth yet, but you'll need to use this little line completion character, the semicolon. Okay, so let's go up here and do the same thing to our text box 1 text changed. So again, message box.show, and then let's put text changed, and again we'll use a semicolon. And then here, message box.show form 1 load. Okay, let's save what we've done. And now let's run our application. So the first message box to appear is letting us know that the form 1 load event fired first. Okay, so we've got that going for us. Now let's go ahead and change the text in this box, and notice when I type the A on my keyboard that the text change event fires at that point. So let's go ahead and close this down. So at this point we were able to get our form 1 load and our text change message box to show. We weren't able to get our leave message box to show because there was no other control for the focus to leave to. So let's just add a button here, and that should be enough. Let's run this application again. Okay, so we get our form 1 load, we get our text changed, and now I'm just going to use the tab key on my keyboard, and when I do, the leave is fired. Now I'm going to click the button, and notice that nothing occurs. That's because we chose not to put any code in the button click event handler. Now that makes it, in this case, pretty useless, but the key here is that you don't have to write code for every single event that's fired by a given control. You only pick and choose the ones that are applicable to what you're trying to accomplish with your application. So if we wanted to handle this, all we would have to do is go to our application and double click our button 1. By default, we get the button 1 click event stub created for us, and we can write, our message box.show and then put button 1 click, or whatever we choose to have happen whenever that button is clicked. Now, I just want to reiterate one thing, that Visual Studio creates these stubs for you in the code view. That if you did not use Visual Studio, this is something that you would have to create for yourself. You'd have to type it in exactly, private void button one click, and then put in the correct parameters that are passed in from the .NET framework into that event so that it would fire correctly. There's also one other piece of code, and that is the registration of that event with the application. And so I kind of clicked open this region Windows Form Designer generated code, and you'll notice here that, for example, this .textbox1 leave, and then there's this plus equals new system event handler, and then it passes in an instance of this textbox1 leave. Okay, so basically what's happening is, whenever we told Visual Studio that we wanted to write code for the leave event for the text box, what it did was inserted this line of code. It was hidden to us, but it's still available to us if we want to open it up and change it in any way. That whenever this method is fired, that this event handler should be invoked. In this case, we want to invoke the textbox1 leave method, and that corresponds directly to this section of code that's defined right here. So while Visual Studio.NET takes care of some of the messy details for you, it's important to know how things work behind the scenes, so that if you ever have an event that's not firing and you're looking and you're saying, well, the code is there, I don't understand why it's not working. That's because there's some additional code that actually registers that event with the system to make sure that it fires your code, the appropriate code, whenever that event is fired. Now here's another thing to keep in mind, that you can change this to a different method if you want to. So for example, we could set this to fire whenever the leave occurs. We can set this to execute this line of code, the text change code, instead of the leave code. And all we'd have to do is go up here and change where it says leave to text changed. Now we have two system events that fire the exact same line of code. In this case, they would both fire this line of code, and this code would never get executed. Now realize that might be a little bit over your head at this point in time. If that didn't make sense, don't worry. This is not something you have to understand right now, but I've included it here so that you get a more kind of a broader understanding of what's going on behind the scenes in order to support the development of your application. There's one last thing I'd like to say, and that is the order of events. Since there are so many events, sometimes these events can overlap. So whenever you click a text box, it might fire off 3 different events. Maybe the text changed, you've left the text box, or you left another text box, and who knows what else. There might be several here. And so there is an order that the events will take place, and you need to test your applications thoroughly in order for you to understand what is happening and when it is happening in comparison with the other events that might be firing from a similar event. And we'll talk more about testing and debugging your applications much later in this series of lessons. Thank you.